The pleasure enjoyed has indeed the positive significance that self-consciousness has become objective to itself, but equally it has the negative one of having reduced itself to a moment. And since it grasped its realization in the former sense only, its experience is of a contradiction in which the attained reality of its individuality sees itself destroyed by the negative essence confronting it, which is devoid of reality and content, and which yet is the power which destroys it. This essence is nothing else than the notion of what this individuality in itself is. It is, however, as yet the poorest form of self-realizing spirit, for it is aware of itself at first only as the abstraction of reason, or is the immediacy of the unity of being for itself and being in itself. Its essence is, therefore, only the abstract category. Nevertheless, it no longer has the form of immediate simple being, as it has for reason in its observational role, where it is abstract being, or posited in the form of an alien being, is thinghood in general. Here in this thinghood there has entered being for self and mediation. It therefore makes its appearance as a circle whose content is the developed pure relation of the simple essentialities. The realization attained by this individuality consists therefore in nothing more than this, that is, that it has cast forth this circle of abstractions from its confinement within simple self-consciousness into the element where they are for self-consciousness. In other words, are expanded into an objective existence. The object, then, that is for self-consciousness as it takes its pleasure, its essence, is the expansion of those empty essentialities of pure unity, of pure difference, and their relation. Beyond this, the object which the individuality experiences as its essence has no content. It is what is called necessity. For necessity, fate, and the like is just that about which we cannot say what it does, what its specific laws and positive content are, because it is the absolute pure notion itself viewed as a mere being, a relation that is simple and empty, but also irresistible and imperturbable, whose work is merely the nothingness of individuality. It is this fixed relation because what is related is the pure essentialities or empty abstractions. Unity, difference, and relation are categories each of which is nothing in and for itself, but only in relation to its opposite, and they cannot therefore be separated from one another. They are related to one another through their notion, for they are pure notions themselves. And this absolute relation and abstract movement constitutes necessity. The merely single individuality, which in the first instance has only the pure notion of reason for its content, instead of having taken the plunge from dead theory into life, has therefore really only plunged into the consciousness of its own lifelessness, and has it as its lot only empty and alien necessity, a dead actuality. In the video commenting on the paragraphs just preceding this particular paragraph, number 363, I had remarked that Hegel's treatment of hedonism is probably one of the strangest ones you're ever going to run across, and I think we could add to that if you took out any reference to the word pleasure, you would have no conception that that's actually what he's considering or talking about. And it just gets stranger in this section as well. I think it's helpful to keep in mind what he's aiming to do here. He's not engaging in something like an analysis of pleasure as such to show that pleasure is not the good, or that pleasure is only, part of the process, or something along those lines. Those sorts of analyses, you can find them done by, say, Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics, or go all the way through to say Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, or Kant, right? Discussions of pleasure in him, and that's not what Hegel's really about. Keep in mind what this entire section is reason, right? So the reason section is self-consciousness trying to make sense of itself, trying to understand what it is, in relation to its other, which is the world. And that is not just the world of things, which we were looking at an observing reason, but very quickly becomes a world of other consciousnesses, a social world, a cultural world, if you like. So the discussions of pleasure fit in there. And let's remind ourselves, why did pleasure end up being the thing that the self-consciousness was seeking? Was it just looking to escape? Was it engaging in getting itself off in one way or turning itself on, as these metaphors go? Was it just stimulus response? It finds something that feels good to it and it just keeps on doing that and pursuing that? No, it's searching for its happiness, its Glück, right? It's what is going to fulfill it. You notice that we were using this term essence and essentiality, Wesen and Wesenheit here. That really is, to make a little joke, essential to this entire process. Self-consciousness has moved away from observing reason, and now it is trying to make sense of itself in terms of its own individuality through its actions and engagements with the world. So what does pleasure offer to it then? Well, this is a good place to go to the text. Notice that we've got this reference to what he's talking about at the very end of this section, and we begin with what he's talking about at the start of this paragraph, right? So let's actually start at the end. He says, the merely single individuality, self-consciousness, which in the first instance has only the pure notion of reason for its content, instead of having taken the plunge from dead theory into life, has therefore really only plunged into the consciousness of its own lifelessness and has as its lot only empty and alien necessity, a dead actuality. So there's a couple things to be said at that point, right? That's where the paragraph is going to end. That's where all this stuff comes in. This section, or this subsection of a subsection, is entitled Pleasure and Necessity. And what we've got is, in the pursuit of pleasure, not just for the sake of enjoyment, but for the sake of getting to understand what it is, making sense out of life, it winds up, there's a dialectical transformation that takes place, and it winds up running into necessity or fate. This is going to be very important because this will lead to a transition to the next section as well. What the person is attempting to do is to lose and find themselves in life. And remember that for Hegel, life is this plenitude, this plenum of all sorts of things that emerge, that are largely unpredictable and follow their own developing logic out. So that is what the pursuit of pleasure sometimes feels like, and it's how we sometimes depict it to ourselves. And you can think of people who glorify not necessarily the pursuit of pleasure as such, but glorify life and think of it in terms of, eating, drinking, having sex, sort of a naturalistic, as we call it, sort of attitude towards things. Think of novelists who do this. Think of people who write songs. Think of people who create shows and movies. What they're after is something very hard to articulate. And sometimes they'll just come right out and say, it's all about life, man. And so that is what Hegel is talking about. There were plenty of people in his own time who were doing that sort of thing. It's not as if that only came about in the 1960s or, limited amounts in the 1940s or the Roaring Twenties or anything like that, right? That attitude has been around for a very, very long time. Why? Because that's one way in which consciousness, people, human beings, try to make sense out of themselves and the stuff that they get involved in. So that's that part. Now he talks about pleasure enjoyed. Pleasure is something that we could see as happiness precisely because we do enjoy it, right? And if we don't enjoy it directly, at least somebody else talks to us about it and says, oh my gosh, you have to experience this. This is so amazing, so wonderful. I'm willing to pay $1,000 for this experience. And we're like, wow, that person thinks it's pretty good. Maybe there's really something to that. And if you think about it, this is a bit of an aside, so many magazines, so many websites are based solely around this premise of somebody else experiencing something and then giving us some guidelines about that. I mean, even some of the ones about the life of the mind are along those lines. Oh, you haven't read Oscar Wilde? Well, you don't know what you've cut yourself off from. Oh, you haven't read Proust's, monumental opus, which I'll admit I haven't read. I started reading it and got really, tired of it fairly quickly and decided I didn't need to spend any more time on it. All these realms and ranges of pleasure offer us the possibility of enjoyment. And what is that about? Hegel says, the pleasure enjoyed has a positive significance. What is its positive significance? Self-consciousness has become objective to itself. And then he goes on and says, but equally it has the negative one of having reduced itself to a moment. This is where the last paragraph left off, right? When you enjoy pleasure, and you consider what it is that you're enjoying, and you try to orient your life and your thought around that, and make sense of it, whether it's the pleasure of company with friends, whether it's shooting pool in the bar, whether it's swiping, I'm not sure on Tinder whether they swipe right or swipe left, but swiping until you find somebody and hook up with them, whatever sort of thing you're talking about, people engage in that not just for the sake of sort of pleasure stimulus. It's not just brain chemistry. They find it, in some sense, meaningful. But the problem with pleasure is that it can't actually function as an adequate vehicle for the meaning that people are looking for in life. Pleasure is not adequate to life, you might say. And so what do we find out? There's a contradiction here. Self-consciousness becomes objective to itself through how it enjoys pleasure, through how it makes sense of that, and how it responds to it. Yet at the same time, it also realizes that it's just one, of many possible individuals enjoying pleasure. It's not really my pleasure itself that counts so much, because insofar as I can even talk about it with other people, it's already become something objective and in that sense escaped me, and we can go on and on and on. So he says, since it grasped its realization in the former sense, only the former sense of being objective to itself, its experience is of a contradiction. There's a contradiction, a Widerspruch. Think of this in terms of, very lexical terms, speaking against, speaking contrary to. The pleasure itself is, talking to you and saying, here's what I have to reveal to you. And then something else, a voice out of nowhere, you could say, as we'll see why, is saying, no, something more, something less, that guy's got it wrong. So what does he go on to say? Its experiences of a contradiction in which the attained reality of its individuality, its being objective to itself, sees itself destroyed by the negative essence confronting it, which is devoid of reality and content, and which yet is the power which destroys it. Now, isn't that an extraordinary thing for Hegel to say? What we have here is some sort of confrontation between the individual in the case of his or her exploring and enjoying and reflecting on their pleasure, and strictly speaking, a nullity, a nothing. He calls it a negative essence. He goes on and he doesn't just say it's a negation or something like that. He says that it is devoid of reality and content. We're going to see what that actually is in a moment. At this point, it sounds like a mere nullity. This should remind us, if we've ever read, say, Heidegger's what is metaphysics of the nothing that Heidegger talks about, which is intrinsic to human freedom and annihilation and all this other stuff. Hegel's doing something a bit different here, though, with the nothing. So he goes on and he says, this essence is nothing else than the notion of what this individuality in itself is. The contradiction arises within individuality, within self-consciousness. It's not something that can be escaped. This contradiction is not something purely external to it. And so he goes on and he says something really interesting here. He says, it is, however, as yet the poorest form of self-realizing spirit, for it's aware of itself at first as only the abstraction of reason, or it is the immediacy of the unity of being for itself and being in itself. A lot of metaphysical terminology there. But think back to what was going on in the earlier part of the reason section, where we were engaged in observation, ultimately, of things and trying to make sense of thinghood, and we even transformed spirit and the individual into a thing. Now Hegel says we are actually exploring something a bit different. Now thinghood has become, as he's putting it here, it's entered being for self and mediation. The thing is no longer just a thing. The thing is self-consciousness. Even the thing that we were enjoying, as we saw in the previous paragraph, enjoyment is not just of the passive thing that we consume. It also involves, in some sense, the other, and that other is another consciousness, another self-consciousness. So, we now have an important transition. Here he starts speaking in some pretty metaphorical language, which is a little bit difficult to represent in a two-dimensional space on the chalkboard. But what does he have to say? He says, the realization attained by this individuality consists in nothing more than this, that it has cast forth this circle of abstractions. That's what we got here, a circle of abstractions, from its confinement within simple self-consciousness. So this circle of abstractions was within simple self-consciousness, which is part of the concrete human being, who is not abstract, who is self-consciousness in real, mediated ways. Then he goes on and he says, into the element where they are for self-consciousness. In other words, they're expanded into an objective existence. So once again, let's remind ourselves of what's going on here. Through engaging in pleasure, consciousness got to know itself. It became objective to itself. There's objective existence, as Hegel's calling it. At the same time, there's also this circle of abstractions which is being brought into the very heart of that objective existence and being made objective. Now, in being made objective, it's no longer just this purely negative essence that has no content, no reality, nothing other than its, we might say, bare possibility, or its no, right? Now it should have some sort of reality of its own, contingent, of course, upon the self-consciousness. Here's where it gets really, really interesting, and I think for a lot of people probably a little bit hard to follow. What is the expansion of this pure relation of simple essentialities, Wesenheiten, right? Not just Wesen, essences, but essentialities, the being, the kind of things that are essential, right? Well, this is where he starts talking about the category or the categories. Unity, difference, relation, which is going to lead us into something else in a moment. But let's now go on to that. So he says, the object then that is for self-consciousness, as it takes its pleasure, its essence, is the expansion of these empty essentialities. There he says empty, right? Before he was saying simple essentialities, now he calls them empty essentialities of pure unity, pure difference, and their relation. Notice what he's not saying there. He's not saying, we have unity, difference, and relation, and these are three different things, totally separate from each other. The categories, instead he says pure unity, reine Einheit, pure difference, rein Unterschied, right? And then their relation, ihr Beziehung. Not pure, not rein, right? There is no pure relation, right? You can't talk about pure unity, pure difference. Although notice, as he's going to say a little bit later on, you don't actually get them pure, right? You get them because they are related to each other. How are they related to each other? Well, by opposition to some degree, which then, of course, means that unity and difference are related through difference, right? And at the same time, there's a unity there, which means that there's a relation there, which means that they're in a certain way a unity, and we can go on and on and on. It's very reflexive what's happening here. Notice what else it is, though. Once we start getting into this, where's pleasure in all of this? Hegel says, well, in enjoying this, we're somehow also involving this stuff over here. This is like totally removed from pleasure, right? He doesn't try to apply it and say, oh, well, there's a unity to pleasure, there's a difference to pleasure, there's a relation to pleasure, or anything like that. He just says these are the things that arise for self-consciousness. The object that is for self-consciousness, as it takes its pleasure, its essence, is the expansion of those empty essentialities of pure unity, pure difference, and their relation. Beyond this, the object which the individuality experiences as its essence has no content. So if beyond this it has no content, then we're back to this negative essence again that we had before, except it seemed to have some content but doesn't actually have any content. What can we say about it? Here's where Hegel brings in what we've been aiming at the entire time, fate or necessity. He says it is just what is called necessity. For necessity, fate, and the like, whatever else we want to call it fortune, call it, the dialectical process of history, whatever you like, whatever you're going to treat as just being a deterministic process that you have no control over and very little insight into, that's what fate or necessity is. Because look at what he says about that. He says, necessity, fate, and the like is just that about which we cannot say what it does, what its specific laws and positive content are. Why? Now, it's interesting because he doesn't say at this point, well, we just don't have enough insight into it. If our sciences were good enough, then we could chart out where every single atom is and predict the future based on that, and we would understand all of that. Hegel doesn't go that direction at all. He doesn't even consider it at this point. And when Hegel doesn't consider something, it's usually not because Hegel didn't think of it. It's because Hegel says that's not really relevant here. Why are these without content? Why don't we understand what fate or necessity is until it reveals itself to us? Well, here Hegel sort of draws us off in two directions. He says, well, on the one hand, that's because it's the pure notion. We haven't yet grasped the pure notion. Hopefully by the end of the phenomenology we have, or at least by the end of this section, hopefully we have. But we actually haven't at this point, this juncture. What else can we call it? Here he talks about being, or Miller has mere being. And remember, being for Hegel is sort of as low as you can get, right? Mere being is just actuality, doesn't really have any meaning or anything. It's certainly not the notion, but fate or necessity is something that we can look at both as these. He says it's the absolute pure notion viewed as a mere being. So these are not disconnected from each other. A relation that is simple and empty, but also irresistible and imperturbable. So it does what it does. We can't stop it. Our pleasure that we're engaging in starts to look like something really tiny and unimportant in relation to this colossal, titanic necessity that is confronting us. And what we get then, him saying is that whose work is merely the nothingness of individuality. The nothingness. So when we're experiencing pleasure, if we think beyond the experience of pleasure, if we don't simply lose ourselves in that, we're always at the edge of a sort of precipice where we can look down and see this necessity, see this nothingness, see this absurdity to a certain extent that simply doesn't make sense to us. And our reaction might be, man, I'm just going to enjoy some more pleasure, not think about that. Have another beer, smoke another cigarette, have sex again, watch another show. But if we start thinking about it, we start to see how unimportant, how not an answer to the question of happiness, the pleasure that we're trying to take, really is. So he goes on and he talks again about pure essentialities, empty abstractions. He says unity, difference, and relation are categories, each of which is nothing in and for itself, but only in relation to its opposite, and they cannot be separated from one another. Notice that we don't have, all of these as each one has its own opposite. They're all opposites to each other in a certain way. How can they be three opposites? Well, this is a triadic structure rather than a merely dualistic structure. That's part of what makes it dynamic. So he goes on and he says they're related to each other through their notion, right? Because they are notions themselves. That is what they are. They are something for us to explore. They are something for us as self-consciousness to make sense of. But we have nothing to grip onto at this point. So in trying to work through this, dialectic or this response of seeking pleasure, we found our way now to necessity. And we reached the point in the end where he says, that the merely single individuality, which in the first instance has only the pure notion of reason for its content, tried to make the plunge into life, was going to find its meaning there, or at least something that would engage it. Now, instead, here's where we can grasp the true meaning of these words, it's therefore only plunged into the consciousness of its own lifelessness, and has as its lot only empty and alien necessity, a dead actuality. It's now realized that this, and not the pleasure, is what is there for it to grasp in terms of its happiness, in terms of its meaning, in terms of its understanding of itself.